What if the first kings on Earth didn't claw their way up from tribes and war, but dropped out of the sky? What if, before anyone scratched a single symbol into clay, before any priest told the story of a great flood, there were 8 beings ruling this world from a pyramid of living fire, ruling not for years, not for centuries, but for stretches of time, so long they make all of human history look like a weekend. That sounds like pure myth, right? Except it's written down. On the oldest tablets of Sumer, there's a document scholars call the Sumerian king list, row after row of cuneiform signs, pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago. And on that list are names: Alulim, Alaugr, Emin-Luana, Emin-Galana, Demuzid, Emin-Durana, Ubar-Tutu. Ancient scribes described them as kings, but their reigns aren't measured the way we measure lives. Not in decades, not even in centuries. They're counted in spans of time so huge you almost want to laugh. 28,800 years for Alulim, 36,000 for Alaugr, 43,200 for Emin-Luana. 8 rulers whose combined reigns add up to 241,200 years. 241,000 years of rule before history even begins. And then the text does something strange. It doesn't trail off into poetry. It doesn't end with happily ever after. It stops hard with a single chilling line. Then the flood swept over. That's it. World over. Curtain down. So here's the question we're going to explore. Were these just symbolic numbers, or was someone trying to tell us that once upon a time, kingship itself didn't belong to human beings at all? Because according to the same civilization that gave us writing, law, and some of the earliest cities on Earth, kingship descended from heaven. That's their phrase. When rulership appears in a record for the first time, it doesn't evolve from tribes or grow out of politics. It arrives from above. We're stepping into the gap between myth and archaeology. We're walking into a time before the flood, a time when the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens, supposedly walked openly among humans. We're going to trace a story that starts in the baked mud of ancient Mesopotamia and ends, maybe, with a real structure buried under its sands, a scorched ziggurat, a broken crystal at its summit, and 8 stone figures standing guard around its base. We'll get there, but first, we need to understand why those old tablets are such a problem. Because they don't just list impossible kings. They also list very normal ones. On the same columns of clay where Alulim rules for 28,800 years, you also find later rulers whose reigns are measured in human terms. 10 years, 25 years, 43 years. Kings whose names match other texts. Kings whose cities and palaces and graves archaeologists have actually dug up. So within a single document, you've got 2 worlds. Before the flood, rulers with lifespans beyond comprehension. After the flood, rulers bound by the same mortality you and I face. Between them, one sentence. Then the flood swept over. If the second half of that list reads like sober history, and a lot of it checks out, why do we automatically file the first half under myth? Why do we say, oh, those numbers are just symbolic, while trusting everything that comes after? Most scholars will tell you exactly that. The early reigns aren't literal. They're symbolic. Those giant numbers, they say, represent cosmic cycles, astronomical periods, or layers of legend compressed into a single king. It's a neat explanation, but it runs into a problem. Those huge reigns aren't random. They line up with a unit the Sumerians used called a sar, a block of 3,600 years. Their whole mathematical system is built around base 60, and these kingly reigns fit into it like carefully chosen pieces. Alulim's 28,800 years, exactly 8 sars. Alaugr's 36,000, exactly 10 sars. Emin-Luana's 43,200, exactly 12 sars. That's not sloppy storytelling. That's calculation. So we're left with a choice. Either the first part of the king list is a kind of coded astronomy lesson disguised as royal history, or it's preserving a memory of something that really happened in a very strange age before the flood, when the beings in charge of early cities were not like us at all. Beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki, those who came from heaven. Were they gods? A previous, more advanced civilization? Something in between flesh and blood rulers with technology so far ahead of their time that later generations could only describe it as divine? In this series, we're going to follow that question across tablets, temples, and myths. Different cultures, different languages, same pattern, long ages, a great flood, and then everything shrinks. Our story is about that older age, the age when, if the tablets are telling even a half-truth, someone stood on this planet and ruled for 10, 20, 30,000 years at a time. The age when, according to the legend, a pyramid of eternal flame connected Earth to a crossing world called Nibiru. The age when 8 beings, called kings, stood at the center of it all. But to really feel how strange that world would have been, numbers aren't enough. We need to see it. So for the rest of this episode, we're going to rewind. Not centuries, not even millennia. We're going to roll time back past the first cities, past the first clay tablets, past the first shrines. Back to a night when there were no temples, no writing, no concept of king at all. Just scattered tribes under a sky much darker and sharper than anything we see today. On one of those nights, according to the story, something impossible happened. The sky made a sound. It wasn't thunder. There were no clouds. It was a rolling vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, shaking stone and bone alike. Hunters and gatherers, people who had only just learned to tame fire, looked up in terror. The sky was bleeding light. From a wound in the heavens came shapes, not ships with sails, not anything that would look familiar to us. Forms of luminous geometry, hard to describe with modern words, moving with impossible control. Ancient texts from many cultures would later call them Vimana, Merkaba, divine chariots. The Sumerians would use a simpler phrase, the boats of heaven. 8 of them, 8 trails of fire crossing the prehistoric sky. And they were falling toward a stretch of marshland where 2 rivers met, the place those same people would one day call Eridu, the first city, the place where, in the words carved into the oldest clay we found, kingship descended from heaven. That's where our story truly begins. The glow hit the ground first. Those 8 burning boats of heaven didn't drift down gently like falling leaves. They came in with the authority of a verdict. As they hit the marshlands where the rivers met, the world convulsed. The earth shuddered. Cracks raced through rock. Riverbanks collapsed. Water leapt out of its channels, as if trying to flee what was arriving. For the humans watching from treelines and caves, it was like watching the gods tear the skin off reality. When the dust finally settled, the noise faded, and the scorched air cooled enough to breathe, they saw them. 8 figures stood on the plain. They were tall. Not tall like a basketball player, tall in a way that made human proportions feel wrong. Their limbs were too long, their presence too heavy. Later scribes would call them the Shining Ones, and you can see why. Their skin didn't just glow. It reflected light like metal and stone, like polished bronze and pale moonstone. In the darkness, they glimmered. Their eyes were worse. Or better, depending on how you feel about staring straight into something that doesn't belong to your world. They looked deep, like you could fall into them and keep falling. Humans who met their gaze described feeling like a bug pinned under a magnifying glass, examined, cataloged, and then either spared or ignored. These weren't ghosts. They cast shadows. They left footprints in the still soft ground, depressions bigger than human heads. Their chests rose and fell. You could hear them breathe. They were not ideas, not hallucinations, not dream beings. They had weight. And when they spoke, it was like the air itself learned a new sound. The first of them stepped forward. Later, the tablets would call him Alulim. His voice didn't just pass through the air to your ears. It vibrated straight into your bones, into the spaces behind your eyes. Here, he said, we begin. The plain they'd chosen wasn't impressive. No mountains, no palaces. Just wetlands and mud and tangled reeds. But it sat in a precise place between 2 rivers, a junction of water and stone and sky that fit some geometry only they fully understood. The humans huddling at the edges of the light would later name it Eridu, the first city, the place where civilization would be born. Birth, by the way, is rarely gentle. The 8 spread out, taking positions around the empty marshland. If you could have looked down from above, you would have seen them forming a shape an 8-pointed pattern that wouldn't make sense to astronomers for thousands of years. Only when someone mapped the same configuration in the sky and realized the pattern on Earth was a deliberate mirror, they raised their hands. It's easy to assume hands is just poetic license, but whatever those appendages were, they moved like hands, and from them came light, not fire. Human fire flickers and devours and throws off smoke. This light was clean and cold and surgical. Where it touched rock, rock flowed. Where it touched sand, sand fused into sheets of glass. The very crust of the earth bent like hot metal under a hammer. Alulim took the northern point. Even among the 8, he radiated something older and heavier, a presence the Sumerians would later associate with knowledge. Just standing near him, the world seemed to snap into order. Like chaos itself remembered it had rules. To the south stood a Lauger, embodiment of law and structure. His voice rang like a hammer on an anvil. When he spoke, boundaries appeared. Lines between land and water, zones of use and protection, invisible fences in the fabric of reality. In the east, Luana carried the current of creation. Plants responded to him, swelling and budding out of season. Dry ground found water. Seeds burst into life as though time were sped up around his feet. In the west, Galana held judgment. People said his gaze could weigh a soul. He spoke less than the others, but when he did, entire courses of action changed. Between the 4 cardinal points stood the others. Demused, radiating renewal and regeneration. Enmeduranki Eminurana, guardian of ascension and connection between worlds. Emipazadana, keeper of balance. And finally Ubertutu, whose domain was preservation. Not just of food or stone, but of memory itself. At first, they ignored the humans watching from the dark. They weren't there to give speeches. They were there to build. According to the legend, the construction took 7 nights. On the first night, they scrubbed the world. Every bump, every uneven patch of earth, every root and stone vanished. The land leveled, polished until it reflected starlight, like black glass. Imagine standing on ground that looks like obsidian and feeling a hum under your feet. On the second night, stones appeared. Not little bricks you could haul in a wagon. Huge basalt blocks, dark volcanic rock that had no business being there. They came from mountains hundreds of miles away, but no one saw them dragged or rolled. One moment the plain was empty. The next, massive slabs stood in perfect formation, already inscribed with symbols that glowed faintly blue in the dark. On the third night, the first tier rose. Step by step, like a staircase for giants, the base of the ziggurat took shape. Not a smooth pyramid, but a series of stacked platforms, each one smaller than the one below it. The proportions were exact. Not, that looks nice, exact. Mathematically exact. Tuned to ratios that modern engineers would later recognize and struggle to replicate. Night 4, the second tier. Night 5, the third. By the 6th, the structure dominated the marshland, a dark, stepped mountain where there had been nothing but mud a week before. On top of that artificial mountain, the 8 placed a capstone. A crystal matrix that didn't resemble any natural mineral on Earth. To human eyes, it looked like a stone, but inside its geometry was insane. Layers of pattern folded into pattern, complexity beyond anything you'd see even under an electron microscope. Later myths would argue about its origin. Was it grown? Harvested from another world? A piece of Nibiru itself? Whatever it was a heart. On the 7th night, they lit the flame. It didn't start from some hidden fuel. It came from above. As the 8 raised their arms toward the capstone, the sky answered. 8 constellations overhead suddenly flared brighter. The same 8 that would, in later ages, be associated with these gods. From those star patterns, beams of light dropped like spears, converging on the tip of the pyramid. The capstone ignited. A column of white gold fire erupted upward. Not spreading, not smoking, just punching straight through the sky. It didn't flicker. It didn't dim. It simply existed. A beam of energy connecting Earth to something far beyond the stars. The 8 stood in a circle around their creation. For the first time, they turned their attention fully toward the humans clustered at the edge of the light. Their voices, when they spoke together, weren't just loud. They were total. You didn't hear them with your ears. You felt them in the liquid of your eyes, in your heartbeat, in the marrow of your bones. We are the custodians. 8 throats, 1 voice. We have come from the place beyond the waters of space. From the world you will call Nibiru. We are the Anunnaki, those who from heaven came to earth. The humans dropped to their faces, not because someone told them to, but because every part of their nervous system agreed. There was no other possible reaction. Your kind has been chosen, the voice continued. You will be shaped, elevated, made into vessels of purpose. From you will come those who carry our light into the ages. From you will spring civilization, knowledge, order. They weren't offering worship. They were announcing a project. You will learn to build, to measure, to record, to remember. This is our covenant with you. We will rule. We will guide. We will preserve you from the darkness that devours lesser worlds. And in return, you will honor us. You will remember us. You will keep the flame alive. Around the base of the ziggurat, the 8 planted standards. To human eyes, they look like ceremonial staffs or banners. But in the ground beneath them, something changed. The soil hardened. The vibration of the earth shifted. Invisible boundaries snapped into place, outlining the first city before a single house existed. Inside that boundary, humans would be taught, protected, transformed. Outside it, the wild old world would continue without them. Alulim stepped forward, the northern king, the bringer of knowledge, and spoke a phrase that scribes would carve into clay thousands of years later. This is Eridu, he declared, the first gift, the first covenant, the foundation of all that will come. When kingship descends from heaven, it descends here. Above him, the flame pulsed. Once, twice, 3 times. And with each pulse, the watchers, those frightened early humans on the edges of the light, felt something unlock inside their heads. A widening, a sharpening. It wasn't like learning a fact. It was like discovering new rooms inside their own minds. That was the beginning. In that moment, kneeling in the sand before 8 beings of fire and starlight, humanity stepped onto a path that would last 241,200 years. The age of the immortal kings had begun. Time gets weird when you put it next to immortality. For us, a lifetime, 70, maybe 80 years if we're lucky, is this huge arc childhood, youth, middle age, old age. We feel it as a journey. For the 8 kings, a human life was a breath. A century was just one long afternoon. Stack centuries into millennia, and the whole thing blurs together. Days stop being special. Generations rise, fall, and fade like waves breaking on a shore that never erodes. And through it all, the 8 didn't age. At first, the people who served them expected to see some change. They watched anxiously for gray hair, deeper wrinkles, the little tremors in the hands that come with age. That's how they measured themselves, so they looked for the same signs in their rulers. They never appeared. Year after year, decade after decade, then centuries rolling into each other. And still the kings looked exactly as they had on the night they came down from the sky. If anything, they seemed sharper, more luminous, as if time itself polished them. Alulim kept his place at the northern temple in Eridu, the beating brain of the first city. Under his guidance, humans learned to measure not just time, but the world itself. He showed them how water moves, how it can be redirected. Standing beside sweating workers in the heat, he traced lines in the air, and canals appeared in the mud. Where his feet touched the ground, the earth softened. Tools cut more easily. The first irrigation channels were dug with human hands, but reshaped by something more. Marshes that had been wild and useless turned into patterned fields. Barley swayed in neat rows, golden and heavy, ripening in seasons that Alulim himself had taught them to track. Water is life, he told them, his voice ringing like a bell. But life without order drowns itself. Learn to channel, learn to direct, learn to build. So they did. Far to the south, in Bad Tibra, a Laugar ruled a city of smoke and fire. This was where humanity learned what metal really was. Before him, fire was warmth and cooking and fear. Under his direction, It became surgery on the bones of the earth. He taught them to coax copper out of stone, to combine copper and tin to make bronze, to shape tools that outlived their makers. His temple sounded like a storm trapped in a building. Hammers ringing, furnaces roaring, apprentices shouting over the noise as they tried to follow instructions that were centuries ahead of them. To a Lauger, that was all trivial. He could do with a gesture what his students spent decades trying to reproduce. When his fingers brushed raw, or impurities seemed to fall away on their own, leaving pure metal ready to be shaped. Law is like this, he said one night, holding a glowing ingot with bare hands. You take chaos. You heat it. You beat it. You give it form. Without structure, everything collapses back into mud. In the East, in Lyric, Emin Luana presided over something even stranger, the birth of writing. At first, he traced luminous patterns in the air, lines and wedges of glowing symbols that hung for a few heartbeats, then faded. Scribes watched wide-eyed and tried to copy them into wet clay with reed styluses. Thought became marks. Marks became records. Records became memory that didn't depend on anyone staying alive to tell the story. Once writing existed, time changed. The past stopped being foggy and started being something you could read. And with that came a disturbing realization. These beings who ruled them never changed. Clay tablets could now track generations, rains, harvests, wars. Humans saw in their own records that dozens of lifetimes passed, and yet the kings at the top of the system remained exactly the same. In Sapar, Emin Galana turned power into something other than brute force. He set up the first real courts, not just tribal elders arguing around a fire, but formal halls where disputes were weighed and decided. Under his gaze, law became something larger than one person's anger. He created codes, preemptive rules for conflicts that hadn't even happened yet. People learned that truth could be explored, that you didn't have to solve every disagreement with blood. It felt miraculous. It also felt terrifying. Emin Galana's justice was absolute. There were no loopholes, no mercy written into the equations. A decision had the weight of the stars behind it. Demuzid moved among the cities as healer. Under his hands, medicine stopped being superstition and turned into method. He knew the architecture of the body like a builder knows a wall. How bones fit, how muscles pull, what happens when systems fail. He taught herbs and surgeries, poultices and procedures. He showed them that death wasn't always inevitable, that you could push it back, sometimes for years. Broken limbs were set straight, fevers tamed. Mothers who would have died in childbirth survived. But no matter what he did, no matter how fine his craft became, one law remained. Mortals still died. The music could delay, but not delete. Emi gave them the sky. He led them onto temple roofs at night and pointed out patterns in the darkness. Not just that looks like a hunter, but real, structured knowledge. He taught them that the stars moved in cycles, that planets wandered, that if you watched long enough and measured carefully enough, you could predict when the river would flood, when the seasons would turn, when eclipses would darken the sun. The priests he trained became living calendars. They could look up and say, in 10 years, the moon will vanish at midday, and be right. They named stars, traced their paths, and slowly realized something eerie. The main constellations above them matched the pattern of the 8 kings around the ziggurat. As above, so below, they whispered, a phrase that would echo in mystery traditions for thousands of years. Emejaranki, master of ascension, turned building into something more than shelter. Under his guidance, architecture became a kind of technology. Temples weren't just houses for gods. They were machines made of stone. He showed them how to align structures with solstices and star paths, how to shape rooms so sound behaved strangely inside them, how to build ziggurats that seemed to pull energy down from the heavens. Even with primitive tools, they raised monuments whose precision still puzzles modern engineers. And overseeing it all, quietly, Ubartutu taught the least glamorous, most important lesson, how to make things last. He taught them to store grain against years of drought, to copy tablets in case of fire, to maintain canals so they wouldn't silt up. He invented the idea of archives, dedicated spaces where knowledge could be kept safe from time and accident. Everything ends, he told them, eyes distant. But the ending can be delayed. Memory can outlive the ones who remember. And through all of this, through the rise of cities and the invention of writing and the birth of astronomy and metallurgy and medicine, one fact kept pressing on the people's minds. The 8 didn't change. If you stood in front of Alulum at 20 and then again at 80, you walked away with the same impression. This being has not aged a day. If you watched the Mused heal children, then came back with your grandchildren, he was still the same. Eventually, people started to whisper the word out loud. Not kings, gods. There were moments when the illusion cracked. Once, during a demonstration in a surgical hall, the Mused cut his palm on a blade. It was a tiny accident, the kind of thing mortals did all the time. But the apprentice who saw it never forgot. The Mused didn't bleed red. What ran from the wound was molten gold. Warm, thick, it dripped onto the stone, dried into metallic dust, and left a stain that no one could scrub away. The flesh beneath sealed over without a scar. The apprentice dropped to his knees. "You're not like us," he whispered. "You're gods." The Mused looked at his own hand for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face. "No," he said softly, "we're not." But to mortals, the distinction didn't matter anymore. Shrines appeared first as little corners in homes. A clay figurine here, a bowl of grain there, a whispered prayer before sleep. Then came bigger sanctuaries, and finally great temples, entire buildings devoted to honoring the 8. Offerings piled up. Festivals were held. Rituals grew elaborate. People gave the kings new titles. Alulum the Eternal, Alaugr the Unyielding, Emenluana the Illuminator, names that blurred the line between king and deity completely. The 8 didn't ask for worship. They didn't exactly reject it either. And that tiny hesitation, that choice not to correct a misunderstanding, slowly created something dangerous. Distance. The more divine the kings became in the people's eyes, the less human they could afford to act. They withdrew into their temples. They stopped walking the fields as often. They appeared mainly in controlled settings, ceremonies, councils, formal audiences. The beings who had once stood side by side with workers in the mud became remote lights on high platforms. And inside those high places, something else was shifting. The first cracks didn't come from the humans. They came from the immortals themselves. Deep beneath the ziggurat, in a chamber aligned to the stars, the 8 met whenever certain constellations lined up overhead. At first, these councils were calm, almost mechanical, updates, decisions, course corrections. Over time, the tone changed. They argued, not with the fury of mortals, but with the stubborn, grinding force of beings who had too long to think about their positions. "They're asking for more," Emenluana said during one council, pacing the polished floor. His body cast no normal shadow, just a soft distortion in the light. "They want to understand the deeper principles. The flame, the stars, the structures behind what we do. We should teach them. And hand them tools that could destroy this world in a single misuse." Alaugr's voice was hard as his metal. "Their grasp exceeds their wisdom. How do they gain wisdom if we refuse them responsibility?" Emenluana shot back. "We hold them as children forever." "How does anything survive?" Alaugr answered. "If we let children play with lightning," it was an old argument by then, but it was sharpening. Some of the 8 looked at humanity and saw students meant to inherit. Others saw a dangerous experiment that needed constant limits. Every new breakthrough, in writing, in building, in medicine, intensified the split. The Mused, who had spent ages bent over sick beds and battlefields, watching mortals die, finally spoke up in that council, his tone uncharacteristically raw. "We watched them wither," he said, "generation after generation. Perhaps we should give them more. Greater lifespans. More of what we are." "No." The word came from Ubartutu, and it hit the chamber like a stone in still water. He rarely spoke in debates, which made everyone listen when he did. "Some gifts become curses," he said. "Some knowledge brings only suffering. We must be cautious about what we leave behind." "Leave behind." Emengalana turned sharply. "You speak as though our reign will end." Silence settled. Above them, the eternal flame shone through a slit in the ceiling, its light steady as ever. But in that stillness, for the first time, the 8 contemplated a thought they had avoided. Maybe this wasn't forever. Everything ends, Ubaradu murmured, repeating the mantra he drilled into mortals for centuries. Even us, perhaps especially us. Outside, up on the blazing summit, the ziggurat's flame did something it had never done before. It flickered, just for a heartbeat, just a tiny stutter in its pulse. But everyone the 8 felt it. On the ground, the people slept peacefully, convinced their shining kings were eternal and the flame above their city would never go out. Beneath that same city, in a stone chamber lit by a light from the stars, 8 immortal rulers stared at one another across the widening gap of their millennial-old disagreement and wondered, for the first time, whether immortality was a blessing or a sentence. The age of their rule went on. On the surface, everything looked stable. The flames still burned. The cities still thrived. The kings still shone. But under all that apparent eternity, the fractures had begun. Of all the wonders the 8 brought to Earth, none matched the ziggurat of Eridu, not in size. Later, Egypt would grow pyramids that dwarfed it, not in wealth. Babylon would rise with hanging gardens and golden temples far more ostentatious. But in purpose, in what it was actually built to do, nothing humanity has ever constructed comes close. Because the ziggurat of Eridu wasn't just a temple, it was a bridge. The legends say it was built in 7 nights. That's true, depending on how you define built. The physical structure rose fast. We've already seen that. But the real work, the activation, took far longer. The priests who inherited the technical knowledge, the astronomers who watched the sky for centuries, left behind fragments that hint at something incredible. The stone part was the easy part. First came the foundation, not on loose soil, but on bedrock. The kings literally dug down to the bones of the earth, carving channels through layer after layer of sediment until solid rock lay exposed. Into that bedrock they set basalt blocks in a pattern that matched nothing known before or since. Not simple squares, not circles, but a geometry that described relationships, not just shapes. Each block was carved with symbols older than cuneiform, a kind of mathematical language that didn't name things but forces. Not stone, but gravity. Not light, but ratios of energy. It was like scribing the laws of physics directly into foundation. Then came the metal, bronze, but not the crude early alloy humans would later struggle to produce. This was a refined blend, laced with trace elements our science wouldn't identify for thousands of years. The molten bronze was poured into grooves cut to the basalt, forming a nervous system of metallic channels. If you could see through the stone, the whole structure would look like a body full of glowing veins. Each layer, and Mejoranki explained to the master builders, corresponds to a sphere of heaven. The ziggurat rose in 7 tiers, each representing a different level of reality as the Anunnaki understood it. The first level, earth and water, the physical plane where humans walked and crops grew. The second, air and storm, wind, weather, breath. The third, fire and energy, transformation, power, the forces that turn stillness into motion. The fourth, the boundary of mortality, the thin line where Earth brushed the edge of the sky. The fifth, the realm of the wandering stars, the planets, the moving lights. The sixth, the domain of the fixed stars, the constellations, the great clock of the night. And the seventh, the void beyond even that, the dark sea between worlds, the space the Anunnaki had crossed to get here. At the top of that 7th tier, they set the capstone, the same crystal core that had first ignited when they descended. It wasn't just a decorative top. It was the key. Everything they had built below was designed to channel energy into and through that crystal. When the last bronze thread was fused, when every angle was measured and remeasured, Alulum stood at the base, lifted his hands, and called the flame. It didn't spark from inside like a lantern. It fell from the sky like a command. A beam of white gold brilliance hit the capstone and rooted there, an unbroken column of light. The ziggurat's bronze veins lit up one by one, carrying that energy through the entire structure, grounding it in the bedrock, looping it through those encoded patterns of force. From that moment, the flame never went out. It pulsed. At first, the rhythm was slow, a beat every several minutes. The priest astronomers, generation after generation, camped out on temple roofs and watched it. Over centuries, they noticed patterns. When certain constellations rose, the flame brightened. When they sank, it dimmed. 8 constellations in particular, the same ones associated with the 8 kings, seemed wired into the thing. As those star patterns circled overhead, the flame's heartbeat synced to them. The ziggurat wasn't just glowing, it was listening. And then there was the bigger cycle. Every 3,600 years, one complete sar in Sumerian terms, something extraordinary happened. Nibiru came close. The Anunnaki's home world followed a stretched-out orbit that took it far beyond the usual solar system, then swung it back in like a dark, massive pendulum. Most of the time, it was invisible and irrelevant, but once every 3,600 years, its path brought it near enough of the ziggurat to lock onto. When that happened, everything stopped. On those nights, the entire known world focused on Eridu. Cities emptied. People gathered on the plains at a distance, forbidden to approach but ordered to watch. The 8 kings took their places at the base of the ziggurat, each standing before the stone statue carved in their image. Each statue aligned with its constellation in the sky. Alulum in the north, Alauger in the south, the others filling the points of a perfect 8-sided shape around the base. As the stars wheeled overhead, the 8 constellations slid into a rare formation. When they locked into place, the kings began to glow. Light leaked from their skin, at first like a faint halo, then rising to full radiance until their features were lost in glare. The flame responded. It shot higher, 50 feet, 100, 1,000, until it pierced the upper atmosphere, a signal visible from far beyond Earth's surface. Through that column of light, something passed. Not words, not images, something bigger. Direct exchanges of information, raw data, commands, and updates compressed into bursts of energy. Reports on the experiment called humanity. Instructions from whatever authority sat above the 8. To the mortals watching from miles away, it was simple. The gods speaking with heaven. They weren't entirely wrong. This went on for ages. Every sar, the alignment. Every alignment, the connection. Until one day it broke. The first disruption came in the 241st millennium of the reign. If you believe the priestly records, by then, humans had learned to measure time with terrifying precision. They knew when the next sar was due. They prepared as their ancestors had. The alignment began like always. The stars slid into place. The 8 took their positions. The flame climbed. Then something in the sky shifted. One of the key constellations, the one associated with Enmeduranki, moved, not slowly like precession, not according to any chart the astronomers had ever drawn. It jumped, a tiny fraction of a degree, but enough. Imagine the universe sneezing. The geometry broke. The flame, which had been a straight, proud pillar of light for hundreds of thousands of years, wavered. Its perfect rhythm faltered, speeding up, slowing down, stuttering. The kings felt it like a toothache in their souls. "Hold formation," Alulum thundered, his voice layered with something larger than himself. "Do not break the circuit." But more constellations were drifting, just enough to throw everything off. The flame twisted, like it was suddenly being pulled from different directions. The column bent. The pulse went wild. From beyond the stars, something pushed back. The astronomers on the plane didn't hear it with their ears. They felt it as pressure in their skulls, a vibration in their bones. A message forced through a failing line. It was too compressed to understand fully, but its essence was clear enough to register in every mind sensitive to it. They were coming back. For the first time in its existence, the flame of Eridu flashed crimson. The 8 staggered. Light bled out of their forms. The shared connection to their distant home flickered like a dying signal. For a moment, all their millennia of certainty evaporated, replaced by something they hadn't experienced since arrival. Fear. And then, with a sound that none of scribes could quite describe, like a scream with no air, like silent shattering, the column of fire collapsed. Darkness. After 241,000 years, the ziggurat of Eridu stood under a starry sky with no flame at its peak. The people on the plain screamed and fell to the ground. Their entire world, their identity, their understanding of reality had just gone out like a lamp. The 8 kings, suddenly feeling their own weight in ways they never had, looked at each other through the dimness. Overhead, the star patterns were still sliding, warping into unfamiliar positions. The covenant, whatever it truly was, had broken. The bridge between heaven and earth had snapped. And somewhere out there, beyond the dark edge of the sky, something vast was on its way back. The darkness didn't last. For 3 days, the ziggurat stood like a dead mountain under the stars. No flame, no hum, no pulse. The people whispered. The priests fasted and tore their garments. Somewhere in the cities, children were born who would grow up never having seen the sky split by that white gold fire. For them, the miracle was already becoming how things used to be. On the 4th night, the flame came back, but wrong. It didn't return as a steady spear of pure light. It sputtered into existence, coughing through colors that had no place in the sane sky. Sickly crimson, bruised violet, a green that looked like rot made visible. The column lurched and twisted. The beat that had once matched the calm turning of the stars now stuttered like a failing heart. The 8 kings didn't gather in calm council this time. They split. In the northern temple of Eridu, Emin stood before a ring of priests, their faces pale in the flickering light. "They are coming back to end this," he said. His glow had dimmed since the rupture. He still outshone any mortal, but now something inside that light looked strained. Not just us. Humanity. The experiment has gone too far. They fear what you become. The priests exchanged terrified glances. "We have a choice," Emin continued. "We can prepare you, give you the knowledge we've held back, teach you how to stand when judgment arrives. Or we can follow Alulim's path, seal everything away, return you to helplessness, make you harmless again." Beside him, Demusid placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture between immortals, but it spoke volumes. "Some of us did not come to build slaves," Demusid said quietly. "We came to build successors." Meanwhile, in the forges of Bad Tibra, under choking smoke and the clang of hammers, Alauga was telling a very different story. "They have forgotten their station," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "We lifted them out of mud. We gave them fire, writing, metal, order. And what do? They question. They aspire. They look at the stars and ask why they cannot stand beside us." Alulim stood beside him, the eldest of the 8, his expression carved from something harder than stone. "The connection failed," Alulim said, "because balance has been broken. Humanity was never meant to climb this fast. Some among us," his gaze drifted in the direction of Eridu, "have been too generous. They have forgotten the pattern. Forgotten what happens when a creation begins to rival its makers." His eyes hardened. "We must restore order. Strip away what should never have been given. Bring them back down. When the judges arrive, they will see that we corrected the mistake. The covenant can be repaired." That was the theory. Reality had other plans. The first strike came without warning. On the dusty road between Eridu and Bad Tibra, a caravan moved along as it had 100 times before. Donkeys loaded with ingots, merchants trading jokes and insults, guards scanning the horizon for bandits who never came this close to the cities of the gods. They didn't hear anything. One moment, the night was ordinary. Crickets, the soft creak of leather, the distant glow of the ziggurat. The next, the world turned to light. Witnesses in both cities reported a flash that erased shadows. A soundless blast that converted sand into glass. When scouts finally reached the site, there was nothing left but a shallow crater of fused green-black material. No bodies. No wagons. Just a ring of ghostly silhouettes burned into the glass, where living beings had been an instant before. No one claimed responsibility. Everyone knew. The war between gods had begun. It didn't look like mortal war. There were no armies marching, no clashing of swords, no battle cries. Humans were, at best, collateral damage. This was a conflict fought with the same forces that powered the ziggurat. Focused, weaponized, and unleashed. Lightning that made no sound. Fire that fell upward. Beams of light that shredded matter. without leaving burn marks. Later scribes would try to describe these events with the language they had. Arrows of heaven, spears of fire, winds that cut. They were metaphors, but the destruction was real. Emin, who had spent ages weighing petty disputes and village feuds, suddenly found himself forced to choose sides. He chose Alulim and Alaugr, the law and order faction. His once measured justice turned brutal. Settlements that pledged loyalty to Emin Luana's more liberal camp didn't just get punished. They vanished. Not destroyed, erased. Fields left untouched, but houses gone. Paths leading nowhere. Places where people remembered a town, but could no longer find any trace of it. Emi Pazadana, keeper of balance, tried desperately to stop the slide. He moved between cities, between camps, pleading for compromise, trying to find some middle path between control and freedom. Balance, though, has limits. You can't balance a scale if both sides are actively trying to flip it. When he refused to pick a camp, both factions branded him traitor. His death is one of those events that shows up in a dozen broken tablets, each telling it differently. The details vary. The core doesn't. The sky above Lyric split. Not like when the Anunnaki first arrived, not with ships and chariots and glory. This was a fraction reality itself. A thin, vertical wound that glowed with a color no one had a word for. Emi Pazadana stood in the center of the city, arms raised, trying to take the hit himself. The energy that poured down was meant to erase Lyric the way whole towns had already been erased. Instead, it met the full resistance of a being who embodied equilibrium. He took it, for a few impossible seconds. He glowed brighter than the ziggurat had ever glowed. His form dissolved from solid to light to sound to something beyond description. Scribes just called it the color of absence. Then he was gone. No body, no bones, no ash. The first immortal dead in 241,200 years. For 3 days, the world went quiet. No more silent lightning. No more burning winds. Even the flame, still unstable, now more fever than a beacon, dimmed. The remaining 7 kings didn't speak publicly. Whatever passed between them during those days, no human heard. But the effect of their conflict was still flowing, whether they were actively fighting or not, because the ziggurat was listening. Every time an immortal unleashed that impossible energy, every erased village, every shattered caravan, every torn patch of sky, the same kind of power that once flowed calmly down into air to bounce around the planet instead. The ziggurat began to drink it. The structure had been built to channel cosmic energy in one direction, from the stars to Earth. Now, it was absorbing raw, unfocused power from every clash, every weapon, every reality-bending event. It brightened. The hum at its core deepened. The bronze veins running through its basalt bones warmed from pleasant heat to alarming glow. The flame, already unstable, started flashing faster, like a heartbeat racing toward panic. Ubartutu, who had stayed apart from most of the fighting, finally left his tower of records and climbed. Imagine being him for a moment. The archivist of an age, the one who spent millennia teaching preservation, suddenly realizing the central pillar of everything you preserved is about to self-destruct. He climbed the tiers alone. By the time he reached the summit, the stone beneath his feet was hot enough to blister mortal skin. The capstone crystal, once a serene, translucent core, now blazed with cracks of light, like lightning trapped in glass. He put his hands on it. He didn't just feel heat. He felt feedback. The entire network of stone and metal, an encoded geometry, sang up through his arms. In that moment, Ubartutu saw the ziggurat the way the Anunnaki had seen it when they designed it, and what he saw made his golden blood run cold. It was overloading. The energy pouring through it wasn't just more than it was meant to handle. It was the wrong kind. Chaotic, unfiltered. The crystal matrix at the summit was fracturing under the strain. Hairline splits crawled through its internal structure. If it shattered, while still entangled with the fabric of reality itself, the explosion wouldn't be city-ending or continent-ending. It would be world-ending. Ubartutu didn't walk back down. He ran. He found the others already on the plains, drawn there by the same sick, rising awareness. They stood in 2 loose clusters, Alulim, Alaugr, and Mingulana on one side, Eminluana, and Demusit on the other, and Mejoranki somewhere in between, like he still wasn't sure which way to lean. "We have to shut it down," Ubar-Tudu said, not bothering with greetings. His voice, usually calm, was ragged. "All of us. Now, full severance." "We can't," and Mejoranki answered, face pale. "The connection to Nibiru is still partially active, if we cut it while they're mid-transit." Then they arrived to find a dead world. Ubar-Tutu snapped. As opposed to what? A world torn in half. On the horizon, another unnatural flash lit the clouds. Someone, somewhere, using power they shouldn't. The flame above them flared in response, roaring brighter. The pulse accelerated. The bronze veins inside the ziggurat's body glowed from red to white, like exposed metal in a forge. Humanity watched from fields and rooftops, from city walls and cave mouths, from any place where the ziggurat was visible. They didn't understand the technical debate happening on the plain. They only saw this. Their gods were in conflict. Their flame, which had always meant protection and guidance, now looked like a fuse burning down. In the temple of Bad Tibra, Alulim stared into the churning core of a forge and spoke words he'd hoped never to say. "If we cannot restore order," he told Alaugr, "we invoke the final protocol." For the first time in an age, Alaugur's iron control cracked. "You can't mean the cleansing." "We wipe it clean," Alulim said. "Return the world to the state we found it in. Begin again. Do it correctly this time." "That will kill them all," Demusit said from the doorway, voice hoarse. He had followed, listening. "Every human, everything we've built, everything we've taught." "Better that," Alulim replied. "Then what is coming?" Demusit didn't answer him. He turned and ran. Back toward Eridu. Back toward Eminluana. Back toward any chance of stopping what final protocol really meant. Because in the calculus of the Anunnaki, there was a way to fix an experiment that had gone too far. You didn't patch it. You flooded it. They didn't get the chance to choose. The ones who built the experiment were already on their way. They didn't arrive with flaming chariots this time. No blazing descent across the sky. No thunder that shook the ground. What happened instead was quieter and infinitely more terrifying. The stars stopped. Every point of light overhead froze mid-rotation. The great wheel of the night sky, which had turned steadily over the earth since the first humans looked up, simply locked. Animals went silent. Wind died. Even the ever-present hum of the ziggurat seemed to hold its breath. And then the sky spoke. The voice wasn't sound. It was pressure, a weight that pushed down on everything living, from kings to farmers to insects in the dirt. It squeezed hearts. Slow breaths made thoughts stutter. People dropped to their knees not because they chose to, but because their nervous systems couldn't handle staying upright. Even the 8 kings felt it. For the first time since they'd arrived on Earth, they felt small again. "Custodians of Earth," the President said, each word bending the air. "You are summoned to account." From the frozen stars, 3 forms descended. If forms is even the right word, later cultures would call them watchers, archons, the heavenly council, the judges of the sky. The scribes who first tried to describe them struggled. They weren't bodies in the way the Anunnaki were bodies. They were concentrations, places where reality seemed to fold on itself, where light didn't just shine, it bent. While the 8 kings glowed, the judges did the opposite. They pulled light in. They made holes in brightness. Looking at them felt like looking at the negative space of existence. They took their positions above the dead ziggurat, forming a triangle over the fractured capstone. Below them, the 7 remaining kings gathered at the base. Their factions didn't matter anymore. War was over. When absolute authority shows up, rebellion shrinks fast. "The covenant is broken," the central judge said. "You were sent to guide. You have created chaos. You were sent to preserve order. You have waged war. You were sent to cultivate vessels for purpose. You have created rivals." Alulim stepped forward. The ruler who had once spoken worlds into structure now sounded almost human. "We sought only to fulfill the mandate," he said, "to shape them according to the blueprint." "You exceeded the blueprint," the judge replied, and the words hit like a verdict. Humanity has learned writing, mathematics, metalwork, astronomy. They build monuments. They measure time. They question. They aspire. They look at the stars and imagine themselves among them. Emaluana's light flickered with something like pride. "Is that not success?" he asked, voice trembling between hope and fear. "We have raised them beyond the original projections. They are magnificent. They are dangerous." The judge said. The other two shifted, and the ziggurat groaned as reality itself flexed around them. "You were warned. The template allows for intelligence sufficient for service, not equality. Awareness adequate for function, not independence. You have created a species that mirrors your own trajectory. You know where that leads." The air went heavy with implication. The mortals didn't understand, but the kings did. "Your own makers learned this lesson," the judge continued, "as did theirs. Creation that rivals creator becomes either servant or successor. There is no third path. Then let them be successors," Demuset said. His voice, the healer's voice, carried a quiet defiance. "Let humanity inherit what we built. They deserve." "You do not define what they deserve." The judge didn't shout. The force behind each syllable made shouting unnecessary. The kings are divided. The covenant is violated. The connection will be severed. They raised what might have been arms. From them came something that wasn't light and wasn't darkness. It was the absence of both. A no wave. A void. It hit the capstone dead center. The flame screamed. For 241,200 years, it had been an open artery between Earth and the deep cosmos. Now, that artery was being cauterized. The column writhed, twisting on itself as the channel to Nibiru tore away. The bronze veins inside the ziggurat began to crack. Energy surged out in violent pulses. The frozen constellations overhead suddenly lurched back into motion, but twisted, like the whole star map had been yanked and resettled wrong. The 8 kings dropped. Their knees hit basalt. Hands clawed at their own skulls. Golden blood surged in their veins and then slowed, thickened, chilled. The light that always poured from their skin dimmed, like lanterns running out of oil. They weren't human yet, but for the first time, they were something closer to it. And then the flame went out. Total, absolute dark. No flicker on the horizon. No glow on the temple walls. The ziggurat, the axis of the world, the mountain that had connected heaven and earth since before humans remembered anything, now loomed as a cold, dead triangle against the frozen stars. Only the judges still shone, and their light was not comforting. The kings are recalled. The central judge said, voice echoing to the stunned silence, "You will return for tribunal. Your stewardship is ended. Your reign is concluded." Alulim tried to speak, but Ubartutu beat him to it. His voice was barely more than a rasp. "And them?" he asked. "What of them?" "The experiment is terminated." The judge replied. 3 words. A death sentence for a whole species. The world will be cleansed. The elevation reversed. Those who survive will forget. The record will be sealed under stone and sand. When the waters recede, humanity will begin again as it was meant to be. "No," Ubartutu breathed. It wasn't a disagreement. It was grief made sound. "You can't. We do not require your consent." And then something hit him. Not energy. Not pain. A vision. His eyes rolled back white, and through those blank orbs came images pouring into his mind, projecting themselves onto his consciousness, like someone was playing the future directly into his skull. He saw clouds, walls of them, stretching from horizon to horizon, black and boiling. He saw rain that didn't fall in drops, but in solid sheets, hammering the ground flat. He saw rivers roar out of their banks, smash through cities, merge into inland seas that kept rising. He saw the ocean come inland, swallowing coasts, climbing mountains. He saw the ziggurat disappear under churning gray, its carefully cut steps becoming a dark blur in a roaring, endless flood. He saw people, millions of them, swept away, tiny and helpless under a sky that had turned into a weapon. He saw the libraries go under, the temples, the fields, the forges, the star charts, the tablets. 241,000 years of accumulated knowledge dissolving into mud and salt. When the vision released him, Ubartutu was shaking. Golden tears streamed down his face, crystallizing into tiny beads before they hit the ground. When he whispered, 7 years, the judge replied, time enough for you to gather what is yours and depart. Time enough for the preparations. The judges began to rise, their work here already basically done. Return to Nibiru, the central presence said. Face your tribunal. Accept your failure. The world will continue without you. Wait! The word tore out of Ubartutu before he could think. He staggered forward, every step a struggle. 7 years, he repeated. Then may I save a remnant? The judges paused. Not many, Ubartutu said. Just enough to remember. To preserve something of what was built here. A seed. Silence. The cleansing will spare those who float, the judge said finally. We do not forbid vessels. We do not forbid preservation. But understand, what survives will be less. Their biology will change. Their minds will dim. You may save bodies. You cannot save the heights they have reached. Ubartutu nodded once, like a man accepting a deal he hates because the alternative is worse. The judges rose. They ascended past the frozen stars, sliding into whatever dimension they'd arrived from. A moment later, the sky snapped. The stars jolted, then began to move again, resuming their eternal dance, but in new patterns, as if the entire cosmic clock had just been reset. The 7 remaining kings stood at the base of their dead ziggurat, diminished, dimmed, their empire cut off at the root. Ubartutu didn't waste time. He walked directly from the ziggurat to the city of Shurapak, to a modest house where his son lived, a house that would one day be turned into a myth called Noah's home. His son's name was Zayusadra. Mortal, mostly, born of a human mother and an immortal father. He carried something extra in his blood. He had lived 4 centuries already and still looked like a man in his prime. Of all humans alive, he was the closest thing to a bridge between the two kinds of being. He opened his door to find his father looking old for the first time. Father, Zayusadra breathed. What? I need you to build something, Ubartutu said, voice raw, big, strong, able to float. A boat? Zayusadra asked, confused. A vessel, Ubartutu said, for everything that must survive. And there, as thin, unnatural cloud began to gather on the edges of the sky, Ubartutu told his son what the judges had shown him. He described the rain, the rising seas, the drowned cities, the forgotten age. He put the weight of 241,200 years of memory into one desperate command. Build. Above them, the stars had already shifted into their new positions, marking an age that hadn't begun yet. The age of gods was over. The age of survival was about to begin. 7 years. On a cosmic scale, that's nothing. On a human scale, it's everything and not enough at the same time. For Zayusadra and the people he trusted, 7 years became a single commandment. Build. They didn't build beside the water, where ships usually rise. Ubartutu's instructions were very specific. High ground, a place where the first waves wouldn't reach, but the eventual ocean would. The vessel wasn't built to be pretty. It wasn't graceful with elegant curves and sails. It was a floating fortress, boxy, massive, its sides thick with timber, every seam sealed with pitch inside and out. Function over aesthetics. Survival over style. 3 decks divided the interior. The lowest were animals that needed less care and light. The middle level for the bulk of life. Pairs and small groups of creatures selected not by sentiment, but by a brutal, pragmatic calculus. What the future would need to restart an ecosystem. The upper level for people, seeds, tools, records, and at the very center, unlike any other vessel ever made, a chamber lined with bronze and stone. This room wasn't for food or animals. It was for a spark, while workers hammered and hauled. While Zayusadra shouted orders and measured beams, Ubartutu made one last pilgrimage to Eridu. He climbed the dead ziggurat steps alone. The flame at the summit was still out. The capstone crystal sat there, cracked, dark, but not entirely empty. Deep inside it, barely detectable, a faint irregular pulse still beat. The last ember of the old flame. Ubartutu placed his hands on the crystal. Golden blood rushed to his palms. The lines etched into the stone brightened. He coaxed the last spark free, compressing it, condensing it into something small enough to carry. When he took his hands away, a shard no bigger than his thumb lay in his palm, glowing like the last coal in a dying fire. He wrapped in oilcloth, nested it inside a box of cedar, which went inside a box of bronze, which went inside a box of gold. 3 layers of protection for the last physical piece of a 241,200-year-old covenant. That box went into the heart of the vessel. While they built, the rest of the world continued. That's one of the strangest parts of any catastrophe story. How normal everything looks right up until it doesn't. People still planted crops, married, argued, had children, traded goods. Scribes kept pressing their styluses into clay, recording loan agreements and temple offerings, and petty disputes that no one would ever read again. Most had no idea judgment was coming. The other kings withdrew, cut off from Nibiru, drained by the severing. They retreated to their cities like dying stars. Some tried to influence things. Some raged. Some simply watched and waited. The judges had left. The mechanism they'd set in motion had not. The sky knew first. It started subtly. On a day that felt like any other, priest astronomers climbed their towers to log the usual movement of clouds and winds and stars. They noticed something off. The clouds were moving wrong. Instead of drifting with the prevailing winds, they pushed against them. Formations that should have thinned out gathered and grew, drawn from all directions toward a point above the land of Sumer. The air felt too heavy, as if the sky was filling with water before anyone felt a drop. By midday, light dimmed. By late afternoon, it looked like twilight. People in the fields glanced up uneasily, sensing a wrongness they couldn't name. Then the first drops fell. They weren't like normal raindrops. Each one hit the ground with the force of a thrown stone, leaving tiny craters in the dust. They were colder than they should have been, as if they'd fallen from a height beyond the regular clouds. When the first hour passed, people said, "This is a bad storm." By the second, the word storm didn't cover anymore. The sky opened. Water didn't simply fall. It dropped in sheets, walls of liquid pounding the earth. Visibility collapsed to an arm's length. Roofs that stood for generations gave way under the pounding. Trees snapped. Soil melted. Then the ground started crying. Wells overflowed. Springs burst where there had never been springs. The rivers swelled so fast their banks vanished in hours. But worst of all, salt water began forcing its way up from deep fissures below, bitter and alien. It was as if the waters of the deep, the primeval ocean that myths talk about, had decided to come home. The sky above and the world below had both been breached. Creation itself seemed to be rewinding. Zayusadra stood at the door of the finished vessel, watching the rain turn the hillside into torrents of mud. The hull creaked as water pooled around its base. Inside, he shouted, "Everyone inside. Now!" People rushed up the ramp. His family, the workers who believed him, the few who chose to trust the warning of a fading god over the comfort of denial. Behind them, animals lowed and bleated and roared, driven in by handlers who had no language for what they were doing except obedience. When the last of them stumbled in, Zayusadra sealed the door. They felt it, that subtle, stomach-dropping moment when the hull lifted free of the earth. For the first time, this impossible box of timbers and pitch stopped being a building and became a ship. Outside, the world drowned. Fields became lakes overnight. Villages on hills became islands. The islands shrank. The water climbed 3 cubits every hour, according to one astronomer who tried to keep measuring even as the city vanished beneath the waves. Walls meant nothing. Fortifications meant nothing. Elevation meant nothing, unless you happened to be on the one vessel designed to float when the world turned to ocean. Inside, the sound was constant. The roar of rain on the roof, the groaning of wood, the panic of animals, the choked sobs of people accepting that everyone they knew who refused the warning was gone. In that central chamber, wrapped in cloth and metal and secrecy, the crystal spark pulsed faintly. If you pressed your ear to the wall, you might have said you heard a heartbeat. Beneath the rising sea, Erida drowned. The ziggurat that defined the horizon for so long became a shadow. Its 7 terraces swallowed one by one. The statues of the kings around its base disappeared under the churning gray. And then something unexpected happened. As the water reached the 7th tier, a glow spread. The flame reignited, not as the old, arrogant column that had once pierced space, but as a sphere, a ghost of its former self. Bronze, amber, sunset-colored. It swelled around the capstone, enclosing the top of the ziggurat in a bubble of light even as the sea closed over it. Underwater, the ziggurat burned. The 8 kings felt it, wherever they were. Those who remained turned their faces toward Eridu, sensing their creation's last act of defiance. The ziggurat refused to die quietly. Even cut off from Nibiru, even drowned, it asserted itself one more time, a beacon marking the end of an age. Some of the kings chose escape. Alulim and Alaugr stood side by side in Bad Tibra as the floodwaters smashed through the city. When the water reached their temple steps, they looked up. Pillars of pale light descended, different from the ones that brought them, colder, thinner, but still a path. Their bodies dissolved into streamers of energy, information compressed into light. They rose, pulled back toward the judgment waiting on Nibiru. Emenluana and Enmeduranki chose a different route. Deep beneath their temples, they had prepared chambers long ago, just in case. Sarcophagi of crystal and bronze waited for them, machines masquerading as coffins. They laid down, sealing themselves in as the waters climbed. Their flesh hardened. Time slowed. Stone and silt would bury them. Maybe, someday, someone would dig in the right place. Demuzid walked straight into flood. No light beckoned him. No chamber waited. He stepped into the churning water and kept going, letting it rise over his head. His body loosened, his form unraveling into the flood itself. The healer who embodied renewal became part of the cycle, his essence distributed through the deluge. Emengalana disappeared into legend. No one wrote down his end. Maybe that was his final judgment, to erase himself completely, punishment and mercy in one. And Ubertutu? He climbed. When the flood reached Eridu, the light sphere was already enclosing the summit. Ubertutu forced his failing body up the ziggurat tiers, step after step, until he passed through that glowing shell into dry bubble around the capstone. The sphere hummed. His skin prickled. The air tasted like the moments before lightning strikes. He placed his hands on the crystal. There wasn't much of him left. The severing from Nibiru had drained him. The war had cost him. The vision had scarred him. But he still held enough to feed the flame one last time. He poured everything into it. His golden blood brightened, coursing from his core to his fingers. The crystal blazed. The bubble around the summit glowed brighter, even as the ocean rose outside. The ziggurat, once a conduit, now became a tomb with a lighthouse on top. Above him, far above, the vessel drifted on an endless gray sea. Day after day, the rain fell. The ship rose and fell on waves that had no shore. Zayusadra kept count. 40 days of absolute violence. Then, slowly, the rain eased. The sky went from hammering rage to grim drizzle to nothing. Silence. The ocean had no horizon. From the deck, Zayusadra saw only water and clouds. No land, no trees, no cities, no ziggurat. Humanity, as far as he knew, existed only in the cramped, creaking space under his feet. Below, the animals murmured and shifted. Above, the clouds remained thick, as if ashamed to reveal what lay beneath. In the depths, the light around Ubertutu dimmed. He had nothing left to give. When the flame finally winked out for the second and final time, his hand stayed fused to the capstone. His body, preserved in that sealed pocket of air and energy, hardened in place. The last king remained at his post, a statue that had once been a person, staring forever up toward a surface he couldn't see. On the surface, Zayusadra watched the sky. 147 days passed. We're used to thinking of the flood as 40 days and nights. That's just the rain. Water doesn't vanish because the clouds stop crying. It lingers. It settles. It reshapes everything. The vessel drifted for nearly 5 months before Zayusadra felt a different jolt, a grinding underfoot, a tilt that didn't correct itself. He opened a hatch and saw a jagged rock rising out of the water. Land. Real land. The ship had come to rest on a peak that hadn't existed in the old world. Later generations would call it Ararat. At that moment, it was just high enough. Ziusidra stepped out onto the deck with shaking legs. The world he saw was not the world he'd known. The outlines of continents had shifted. Mountains had moved. Rivers carved new paths through raw earth. Forests were gone, replaced by blank plains of silt. The scars of the flood were everywhere. No cities, no walls, no ziggurats, no sign that anyone had ever farmed or written or smelted metal. Civilization had been scraped off the planet. He descended with his family, leading the animals out onto bare stone. Every breath they took in that new air was an act of defiance against extinction. In his hands, wrapped in layer after layer of protection, the crystal spark still pulsed weakly. He wasn't a king. There were no kings anymore. But standing on that mountain, with the last ember of the old age in his hands, Ziusidra did the one thing any human in his position could do. He built a cairn of stones. Not a grand temple. He didn't have the material, the workforce, the engineering niche of the Anunnaki. Just a simple pile of rocks on the highest point of the new world. He placed the crystal at its center. And there, as the wind whistled over a planet that remembered nothing, he made a promise to his father, to the drowned cities, to the future. I will remember. But time, he was about to find out, doesn't just erode mountains. It erodes memory. Ziusidra thought the hardest part was surviving the flood. He was wrong. The hardest part was living afterward. The water receded slowly, like a god reconsidering its anger. Valleys emerged, coated in thick mud. New riverbeds cut across the land, glittering threads through raw, wounded earth. Mountains, carved by the weight of oceans, had new faces. It was like walking on a planet that had been given a second draft. Ziusidra and his family came down from the mountain into a silence that felt wrong. No birds. No distant shouts from other villages. No smoke from other hearths. The world had the empty sound of a house after everyone moves out. He unpacked the bundles that represented everything that remained an entire age. Seeds stored carefully against mold, tools hand-forged before the flood, a handful of tablets baked hard enough to survive the journey, and the triple-nested box that held the crystal spark. He didn't rebuild Eridu. That was gone. Its bedrock rearranged, its foundations buried deep under new layers of earth and water. Instead, he did the only thing possible. He started small. A fire, a shelter, a field. His children and grandchildren scattered, as families always do. Some went west, following rivers that tugged them toward new coasts. Some went east, chasing game in greener valleys. Others stayed near the mountains, clinging to high ground as if the ocean might change its mind and come back. Each group carried the same story. At first, the first generation after the flood sat around new campfires and listened with wide, serious eyes as Ziusidra told them what had happened. He told them about the 8 immortal kings who ruled from a pyramid of flame, about cities that connected heaven and earth, about laws that came from beings who glowed like stars. He told them about Nibiru, the crossing world, about the judges, about the warning, about the vessel, about the water. He told them about Ubartutu, and they believed him. Why wouldn't they? Their grandfather had lived more than 400 years and didn't look old. He remembered things in vivid detail that no one else recalled at all. The world around them still carried signs of something colossal. Uprooted forests, carved rock, strange deposits of seashells on mountaintops. The second generation believed. Mostly, they started asking questions. Did the kings really live tens of thousands of years, grandfather? Or is that symbolic? The ziggurat with eternal flame, was that an actual fire, or is it a metaphor for sun? Ziusidra answered as best he could. Yes, the rains were that long. Yes, the flame was real. He'd seen it himself. He'd walked under its light. He tried to explain about stars and cycles and the orbit of a distant world. He tried to condense the technical niche of an entire civilization into words that children with 60-year lifespans could carry. By the third generation, the tone changed. The old man's numbers are exaggerated. Some would say kindly, out of his hearing. No being lives that long. The flood must have scrambled his memories. The pyramid of fire, others argued, was probably just a poetic way of talking about enlightenment. Or the sun, or gods. You know how elders are. They still respected him. They still cared. But the trust had softened around the edges. By the fourth generation, some of his descendants stopped coming to hear the stories at all. They were busy clearing land, busy figuring out which crops like this new soil, busy dealing with the diseases and predators and plain bad luck that always stalks new beginnings. The world didn't feel like the aftermath of a cosmic judgment to them. It felt like life. Hard, ordinary life. Ziusadra lived 900 more years. By later standards, that was insane. By pre-flood standards, it was modest. He watched his children grow old and die, while he remained, slower now, dimmer, but still there. He also watched the bloodline thin. That long lifespan of his wasn't an accident. It was genetic inheritance. Immortal father, human mother. His kids carried a watered-down version of that longevity. They lived for centuries, but not as long as he did. Their kids lived long lives by our standards, but shorter by theirs. And so on. From 900 years, the span dropped to 800, then 600, then 400. Names that would eventually appear in different forms in different texts. Methuselah, Noah, the patriarchs of one tradition, the semi-divine heroes of another. Generation by generation, biology itself seemed to be ratcheting down. The judges had promised the survivors would be less. The promise was being kept. Shorter lives meant fewer memories. By the time Ziusadra finally lay down for the last time, wrapped in cloth and surrounded by a family tree, so huge no one could name every branch, his great-great-great-grandchildren had already begun turning his stories into something safer and simpler than history. Myth. The Sumerian king list, when it finally got etched into clay again thousands of years later, reflected the break. Before the flood, numbers that strained belief. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alaugur, 36,000 years. Emenluana, 43,200 years. 8 kings, 241,200 years in total. After the flood, something completely different. First post-flood ruler, 1,200-year reign. Still huge, but human enough to picture. Then 960, then 780, then 600. The numbers marched downward, reign by reign, until they settled into spans we'd recognize. A few decades here, a couple of generations there. You can practically see the lifespans collapsing on the clay. But even as lifetime shrank, the old story refused to die. Words change as they travel. So do stories. As Ziusadra's descendants walked out into the remade world, they carried different pieces to different places. Along a great river in a land that would later be called Egypt, settlers remembered that there had been rulers before their mortal pharaohs. Not just gods in the abstract, but divine kings with actual reigns, measured in ages rather than years. Priests would later call them the Netjeru. The list of their reigns stretched back into tens of thousands of years. When the historian Manetho eventually wrote those numbers down for the Greeks, modern readers would shrug and say, obviously symbolic. East of there, in the hills and valleys that would become Israel, the story changed shape. Divine kings became giants, Nephilim, fallen ones, those who came down. The long-lived beings walking the earth before flood were no longer shining rulers, but towering hybrids, children of the sons of God and daughters of men. Same idea, mixed blood. Same pattern, long lives. Same ending, a flood. Farther east, in the Indus and beyond, the story stretched and grew layers. The Satya Yuga, the first age, the golden age, was described as a time when gods and humans lived side by side, when lifespans reached into the thousands of years, when truth and law were whole. Each subsequent age grew shorter, rougher, more corrupt. Different names, different cosmologies, same bones, immortal or semi-immortal rulers. Vast spans of time, a catastrophic reset by water, a new beginning with shorter lives. In each place, The number of pre-flood kings varied. 7 here, 10 there, 12 somewhere else. But 8 keep showing up. 8 original rulers. 8 great ancestors. 8 divine beings. 8 is an awkward number to show up that often by accident. The stories reshape themselves to fit new cultures. In one, Ubartutu became Utnapishtim, the man of Shuruppak granted immortality after surviving the flood. In another, he turned into Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. In later retellings, his son's name changed from Zeisser to Noah, and the vessel went from a Mesopotamian barge to a wooden ark on a mountain named Ararat. The details shifted. The pattern stayed. You can almost imagine the judges, watching from whatever dimension they occupy, seeing the memories they had hoped to erase proliferate instead. Not as clean data, but as messy human myths, multiplying across languages and landscapes. Centuries rolled on. Cities rose again, built on top of old mud and older bones. They gave themselves names that echoed half-remembered ones. Uruk, Uar, Lagash, New Eridu. Their kings were mortal now, but they still claimed to rule by divine right, still traced their lineages back to beings who were more than human. The age of the immortal kings receded behind a thick fog of legend, but every now and then it pierced through in a way that was hard to ignore. On a clay tablet in Sumer, on a temple wall in Egypt, in a hymn in India, in a genealogy in a Hebrew scroll, the same whispers. There was a time before. The rulers then were not like us. They lived long. Then there was water. Then everything changed. Thousands of years later, men with brushes and trowels would kneel in the dust of ruined cities, pulling broken tablets from the earth. They'd read lists of names and dates and say, "Ah, here, history begins." They'd see Alulim's 28,800-year reign at the top of the Sumerian king list and chuckle. Obviously myth, they'd say. Then they'd move their eyes down the column, see the names of kings they could cross-check with other records, the same cities they were excavating right then, and say, "These ones, these are real." And sitting in the space between those two reactions is the paradox that started this entire story. If the part of the record we can confirm is accurate, what do we do with the part that isn't so easy to believe? When you fast forward a few thousand years from Ziusadra's campfire, the world looks very different. Kings rise and fall. Empires come and go. Religions are born, rewritten, and re-explained. The 8 immortal rulers shrink into the background of legend, then into symbols, then into footnotes. Most people forget they were ever supposed to be anything but stories. Then a new kind of creature appears on the scene. The archaeologist, not the treasure hunter, not the tomb robber, the patient, almost obsessive digger who goes into deserts with brushes and notebooks and comes back with pieces of past. In the 19th century, those people started poking around the ruins of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the same region where Eridu had once stood. They dug into ancient trash heaps and temple mounds and palace foundations and found clay. So much clay. Clay tablets baked by accident in fires and on purpose in kilns, hardened enough to survive millennia beneath sand and mud. At first, the inscriptions on them looked like scratches, meaningless lines. Then somebody cracked the code of cuneiform, and suddenly those scratches were voices, receipts, prayers, court cases, love poems, and lists, lots of lists. Among them was something peculiar, a tablet that didn't record taxes or barley, but kings. A long column of names and reign lengths. It told a story. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. Then it went on to list who got the job and how long they kept it. At the top, the names you now know, Alulim, Alauger, Emenluena, the rest, 8 pre-flood kings with reign lengths that made even experienced scholars blink. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. They translated the numbers twice, 3 times, thinking they'd misread the units. They hadn't. Then the flood. Then a new set of kings post-deluge, whose reigns were shorter, more reasonable. Still long by our standards. Hundreds of years, but in the same universe as human life. Some of those later kings had already been found as skeletons in actual graves, beneath actual cities. The tablets mentioning them lined up with the layers of soil and rubble the archaeologists were digging through. So here was the problem. At the bottom of the list, history. At the top, myth. Both recorded in the same neat wedges of clay, by the same hands, on the same object. Most scholars did what humans always do when confronted with something that doesn't fit their models. They split the difference. The pre-flood section, they said, is symbolic. The numbers represent astronomical cycles, not literal lifespans. It's poetic. We can ignore it as history, while still learning from it as myth. Case closed, except it wouldn't stay closed. Because it wasn't just Sumer. Over in Egypt, researchers translating temple lists found something similar. Long sequences of gods and divine rulers governing for absurd spans of time before the first mortal pharaoh stepped onto the stage. Their reign lengths, 13,900 years, 11,000 years, echoed the same pattern. Big numbers, then sharp drop into normal human spans. In the Hebrew texts, the genealogies before the flood told of patriarchs living 900 years, 700 years, 600 years, then abruptly declining. In India, the Puranas laid out yugas, ages, whose durations made even Sumer's numbers look modest. Each one began with beings who lived far beyond natural limits, then ended with catastrophe and reset. Different languages, different religious systems, same shape. The flood wasn't just in one place either. Myths of a great inundation showed up everywhere. The Near East, India, Greece, even on the other side of the world among cultures that, according to conventional timelines, had no contact at all. Was it simply that floods are common disasters, and humans tell similar stories about them? Or was there a shared memory, smeared across time and retold in different accents? By the early 20th century, the Sumerian king list had become famous in very specific circles. People argued about it in scholarly journals and over brandy in old libraries. Was it a historical document? A piece of political propaganda? A coded astronomical treatise? In 1922, a particular version surfaced from the ruins of Larsa, a clay prism now called the Weld-Blundell prism. For sides, covered top to bottom in tiny, deadly precise cuneiform. It was one of the most complete copies of the king list ever found. On it, the 8 pre-flood kings and their reigns were written out with impossible clarity. 241,200 years total. It didn't help that those numbers locked perfectly into the Sumerian base 60 system. Each reign was an exact multiple of 3,600, 1 sar, 8 sars, 10 sars, 12 sars. It looked less like wild exaggeration and more like someone had plugged very specific data into a very specific framework. Still, the consensus held allegory. Then, late in the 20th century, the ground itself started arguing back. Satellite imaging, technology that would have looked like magic to the people who built Eridu, began to peer under sand. Infrared and radar scanned the desert of southern Iraq, looking for buried structures. They found something. At first, it registered as an anomaly, an unnaturally straight shape under layers of sediment, flanked by a ring of smaller, upright forms. It was too regular to be natural, too geometric to ignore. The coordinates put it in exactly the kind of place you'd expect an ancient city to be, near old riverbeds, in a basin where past floods had dumped silt for millennia. But the depth was wrong. This thing sat deeper than known Sumerian ruins. Much deeper. Ground-penetrating radar refined the picture. The anomaly resolved into clear outlines, a stepped structure, not huge by Egyptian pyramid standards, but big enough to matter. Around its base, 8 distinct signatures, pillars or statues, each facing outward. The site was hard to reach and politically unstable. Decades passed between surveys and permits. But eventually, a joint expedition set up camp over the strange readings. The digging started. Layer by layer, they went down, moving through time in reverse. Islamic graves, medieval pottery, Babylonian shards, then older, more fragile remnants. The deeper they dug, the older the artifacts. Then they hit a layer of chaos, broken stones, tangled debris, sediments that screamed this was all dumped here by water. Beneath that, untouched earth. And beneath that, it the top of basalt stair. They uncovered it slowly, brushes and small trowels replacing shovels. Black stone steps descended into the excavation pit, leading down to a platform sealed in hard-packed clay. As they cleared, the shape emerged. A ziggurat, stepped and precise, charred black in places, as if it had once endured incredible heat. Not a clay ziggurat, like the later Sumerian versions that melted if not constantly repaired. Basalt and bronze. Around its base, half buried at the cardinal and ordinal points, they found statues. 8 of them, each one massive, carved from stone that had no obvious local source. The faces were unnervingly detailed, almost human, but with proportions just off enough to trigger a sense of unease. Each statue looked outward, as if standing guard. Each pair of eyes angled toward a different slice of the horizon, like spokes on a cosmic wheel. The excavation team joked nervously about finding the 8 kings, but when they worked alone, many admitted they didn't like turning their backs on those statues. They found no inscriptions on the figures themselves. If names had ever been carved there, time had stolen them. But along the ziggurat's lower tiers, beneath layers of encasing clay, they found faint traces of wedge-shaped marks. Too eroded to read on the surface, but promising more below. The real shock came when they reached the summit. The capstone was still there. It wasn't intact. A jagged fracture split it almost in half, like glass struck within by some enormous force. The crystal was cloudy now, its once perfect structure riddled with internal cracks. But when they brought instruments up, out of habit more than expectation, the readings did something no one anticipated. The crystal was emitting a signal. Not loud, not dramatic. A faint, regular electromagnetic pulse. So low frequency it almost vanished into background noise. Once every few years, according to long-term measurement projections, it spiked slightly, then settled. Barely anything, but not nothing. It's impossible, one of the physicists muttered, staring at the lines on his screen. This thing has no power source. Nothing this old should still be doing anything. At night, under the clear desert sky, some of the team began having dreams. They were reluctant, at first, to admit it to each other. Scientists don't raise their hands in morning briefings and say, "By the way, I had a shared visionary experience." But word got around. 8 figures, standing in a circle around a pyramid. A column of fire connecting Earth and stars. A sky full of constellations that seemed alive, like they were watching back. And a voice, not heard but felt, repeating the same phrase. When the stars align again, the covenant will renew. Stress, they told themselves. The power of suggestion. The human tendency to impose story where none exists. The brain is a pattern-finding machine. Give it some ancient statues and vague EM readings, and it will happily churn out apocalyptic visions. Still, more than one team member asked to be reassigned after a few weeks at the summit. Deep below the exposed top of the ziggurat, ground-penetrating radar had identified something else. A hollow chamber beneath the structure. The data suggested walls of unusually dense material, enclosing a void that hadn't seen light since before recorded history. The descent into that space would take time to prepare. There were safety concerns, risks of collapse, pockets of bad air, echoes of earthquakes stored in stressed stone. The permits alone took years. While bureaucracies argued and budgets shifted, the site above slumbered under a patchwork of tarps and scaffolding. The statue stared into the horizon. The cracked capstone pulsed faintly. Instruments quietly logged its whisper signal. And in an observatory halfway across the world, a researcher staring at a screen in the dead of night noticed something in the outer solar system that also shouldn't be there. An object, massive, moving too slowly and too far out to be a comet, following an orbit that made no sense. Unless you'd read a certain old Sumerian story about a wandering world called Nibiru. It started, as these things often do, with someone alone in a lab thinking they'd made a mistake. Kitt Peak National Observatory, Arizona, 3:47 a.m. monitors humming. Coffee cold. A woman named Dr. Sarachin staring at a screen full of numbers and faint lines. She was looking at gravitational data from the outer solar system. Tiny wobbles and deviations in the paths of known objects. Usually, This kind of work is like listening for a whisper in a hurricane. Most nights, all you hear is noise. This time, the noise had a shape, something massive, far beyond Neptune, out past the Kuiper Belt, was tugging on things. Not a star, not a black hole, something smaller, but still big enough to matter. Roughly 4 times the mass of Earth. According to the rough calculations, she ran in a half-awake haze. She checked the inputs, reran the algorithms, verified the data sources. Every time she tried to prove herself wrong, the same solution popped out. An object out there, dark, not reflecting much light, moving along an absurdly elongated orbit that swung way out into deep space and then, every few thousand years, looped back in toward the inner solar system like a boomerang with anger issues. She pulled up historical anomalies, weird perturbations in old astronomical records that had been filed under unexplained. There it was, gravitational oddities around 2000 BCE, spikes in ancient eclipse records around 1600 BCE, gaps where earlier observations would have fallen, if anyone back then had had the tools to see them. A pattern. Roughly every 3,600 years, something big passed through the neighborhood. Sarah sat back in her chair, heart thudding. She wasn't the first person to suggest a hidden planet. Astronomers have been arguing about a Planet X for over a century. But the combination of orbital period, mass, and trajectory she was seeing did something unfortunate in her brain. It matched a story she'd read as a teenager, one of those weird fringe theories about Sumerian tablets and a wandering world called Nibiru. She dismissed it back then as pseudoscience wrapped around a real text. Now, the real text and her very real data were shaking hands. "Don't go there," she muttered to herself, glaring at her screen. "Do not be that person. Stick to the numbers." She tried. She modeled the orbit. 3,600-year period, highly elliptical, tilted slightly relative to the main planetary plane. The simulated path swung wide into the darkness, then came back and toward the sun, skimming the outer edge of the inner system before slinging itself away again. A SAR, 1 cycle. She checked the current position. Inbound. Far out still, no danger collision, but its trajectory would bring it past the inner solar system in 7 years. 7. That number sat in her mind like a stone. In some other part of the world, a different scientist was staring at a different anomaly. Dr. Hassan Rashid stood at the lip of the excavation pit in southern Iraq, looking down at the basalt steps of the ancient ziggurat. The sun was brutal. The air shimmered. His crew moved like slow ghosts across the scaffolding. They had spent days opening a narrow shaft down through the structure, following the radar readings that suggested a hollow chamber deep under the core. Now, finally, a cool breath of air rose out of the darkness. "This is it," someone said behind him. Hassan checked the gas monitor. Oxygen normal. No toxic gases. Structural sensors steady. "We go in," he said. It took an hour to descend. Equipment lowered carefully. Safety lines triple-checked. Every motion deliberate. This wasn't just an archaeological moment. It was a potential tomb. At the bottom of the shaft, their headlamps cut across walls that gleamed unnaturally. Bronze. Not a thin coating, not decorative plating, but thick slabs of bronze forming the chamber's walls. Centuries underground had barely touched them. Symbols crawled across the metal. Not cuneiform, not any script Hassan recognized. The lines felt older. The floor was basalt, polished to a mirror sheen. No dust, no debris, as if the room had been sealed yesterday, not ages ago. At the center stood a low dais, carved in concentric circles like ripples frozen in stone. Rising from that platform was a pillar of crystal, cracked, but still intact. Even before the instruments confirmed it, Hassan felt the warmth radiating from the pillar. Not hot metal warmth. Something deeper. A hum in his bones. A prickle at the base of his skull. His assistant whispered, "It's still active." "Impossible," Hassan said automatically. The sensor in his hand said otherwise. A faint oscillation. An electromagnetic pulse that matched in miniature the readings from the fractured capstone above. He stepped closer, boots scuffing softly on stone that hadn't known footsteps since before the flood myths were even told. Up close, The crystal was worse and more beautiful than he'd imagined. Hairline fractures crawled through its interior like frozen lightning. Strange inclusions glimmer within it, geometric shapes that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle. It was broken, but not dead. "Don't touch it," someone said. "Of course not," Hassan replied. Then he touched it, not because he'd forgotten his own rule, because something in him, some ancient part of his brain that remembered kneeling in the dirt while 8 shining figures spoke, wanted to know. The instant his fingers met the crystal, every device in the chamber went insane. Readings spiked into the red. Monitors screamed. Static roared through headsets. A wave of pressure rolled out from the pillar, slamming into their chests. Above ground, the team in the tent around the capstone jerked as their instruments flared. The fractured crystal at the ziggurat's summit brightened, its faint pulse suddenly a solid line on their screens. Far away, in observatories from Hawaii to Chile to South Africa, astronomers leaned forward in confusion as their star mapping software started drawing the wrong sky. The constellations were moving, not drifting over centuries, the slow precession they all knew and accounted for. Shifting, sliding into new positions in minutes. Stars that had held their coordinates for as long as anyone had recorded them were displacing by fractions of degrees, and the pattern of those displacements matched 8 key constellations around the ecliptic. The band of sky the planets moved through were sliding into a formation that anyone who'd seen the excavation photos could recognize. The same octagonal arrangement as the 8 statues around the ziggurat. Sarah Chin watched the simulation on her screen warp and reconfigure. She pulled up digitized Sumerian star charts from museum archives, old clay tablets inscribed with the earliest attempts to map the heavens. She overlaid the ancient map on the live data. The alignment was nearly perfect. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's a key." Down in the chamber, Hassan felt like someone had dropped him into a river of memory that wasn't his. Images slammed into him. Not visions exactly, more like impressions bleeding through from a mind that had been dormant for a very long time. Stars, fire, a city shining in the dark. A man, not a man. Something more, standing at the top of a stone mountain, hands on the same crystal, pouring himself into it. Hassan's grip tightened. Above him, the ziggurat began to hum. The people on the surface felt it through their boots first, a vibration rising up from the core of the structure. Loose sand jittered. The bronze veins exposed and some of the stepped faces glowed faintly, as if relit from within. The 8 statues around the base, each anchored deep into bedrock, shivered. Dust and old sand cascaded off them in little avalanches, revealing details hidden for ages. The cheekbones, the strange, almost human eyes, the faint traces of inscriptions at their bases. Slowly, impossibly, the statues turned. The stone beneath them did not crack. No machinery whirred. They simply rotated on their axes, as if they were as light as paper, faces tilting upward toward the sky. At the summit, the fractured capstone ignited. The flame that burst from it was not the calm white gold spear of old. It was wilder, edged in deep gold and orange, flecked with colors that didn't quite exist. It didn't climb as high, not yet, but it was sharp and hungry, like a fire that had been starved too long. It punched into the sky. From orbit, satellites registered a spike visible in multiple spectra. Cameras on weather stations caught a sudden flaring column over the Iraqi desert, a vertical wound of light stabbing upward. On Earth, people poured out of houses and cars, shading their eyes and pointing at a new star on the horizon, one that hadn't been there yesterday. On screens across observatories, Sarah watched her simulation of the inbound object, the dark, massive planet entering the inner system. Update as new data came in. Trajectory, inbound. Orbital period, 600 years. Estimated time to nearest approach to Earth, 7 years. Nibiru, the word formed in her mouth before she thought it. She looked from the model of the orbit to the live feed of the Iraqi desert, where flame was now connecting ground to sky again for the first time in an age. Somewhere deep underground, in a bronze-lined chamber, Hassan kept his hand on the crystal pillar, unable or unwilling to let go, as heat spread up his arm and into his chest. In that heat, In that hum, something stirred. In the darkness, fused to the capstone beneath centuries of silt and water, a face that had not moved since the world drowned twitched. Eyes that had remained open but empty for thousands of years began to focus. Ubartutu, last of the 8 immortal kings, drew a breath he had no lungs left to take. Above him, the flame of Eridu roared back to life. The cycle, long paused, was resuming. The first thing Ubartutu felt was weight. Not of his body, that was half stone, half memory, but of everything above him. Sediment, water long gone. Time, the forgotten prayers of people who didn't remember why they were praying. Then he felt heat. The capstone beneath his fused hands shuddered as the reawakened flame forced itself back through fractured crystal. Energy poured into him in reverse, not from him into the ziggurat, but from the ziggurat into him. For ages, he'd been a lock. Now he was a key. His golden blood, congealed into something like metal over millennia, softened and flowed again. Nerves that had been quiet, lit up with pain, real, bright pain. He gasped, and the sound echoed in the sealed chamber like the first crack of thunder after a long drought. The last king woke up. Above him, Hassan ripped his hand away from the crystal pillar with a shout. His palm smoked. The devices strapped his arm when dead, then rebooted with error messages in a dozen languages. "You okay?" his assistant yelled. Hassan tried to answer and realized his mouth was full of someone else's memories. For a second, he wasn't in his own body at all. He was standing on the ziggurat in another age, looking out over a city of lights and canals, feeling the flame at his back and the weight of a covenant on his shoulders. Then he blinked, and he was just a man in a dusty jumpsuit, in a chamber deep under the Iraqi desert, staring at a crystal that had no business being warm. "We need to get out," he managed. "Now." On the surface, chaos was starting to bloom. The flame had gone from a thin spear to a thick column, thrumming with a bass note that vibrated teeth and camera tripods alike. The 8 statues stood fully revealed now, faces clean, eyes tilted toward the sky. The air smelled charged like before lightning, only there were no clouds. The Iraqi government ordered a cordon. The UN called an emergency session. Someone in a control room sent up a drone. It got within 50 meters of the flame before its electronics fried, and it dropped out of the sky like a stone. The footage made it to the internet anyway. You know what happened next. On one side, headlines. Mystery light phenomenon over Iraq. Ancient pyramid emits energy column. Scientists baffled by desert beam. On the other side, forums lit up with old names. Eridu, Anunnaki, Nibiru, Sumerian king list. People dug up scans of the well Blundell prism and circled the pre-flood section. Grainy photos of the 8 statues leaked from someone's phone and went viral overnight. Threads began to connect Sarah Chen's leaked orbital data with Hassan's ziggurat, with passages from Enuma Elish in Genesis and the Puranas. In chat rooms and kitchen conversations, one question cut through all the noise. What if the myths weren't metaphor? In a secure room, Sarah pointed at the model of the inbound planet, and then at the live feed of the flame. 7 years, she said. The object reaches its nearest point in 7 years. The last time something like this happened, she tapped a tablet displaying a digital copy of the king list. Everything resets. Resets how? A politician asked. She hesitated. There are flood myths on every continent, she said finally. And every one of them talks about an age of gods or giants or divine kings ending in water. If the object's orbit triggers gravitational or tidal effects, you're saying it'll cause another flood. I'm saying, Sarah replied carefully, that the last time this orbit came through, every early civilization we know about went into some kind of collapse. Bronze Age. Almost all at once. We have written records from that one. The one before, we've only got stories. Behind her, the flame on the monitor flared brighter, like it was agreeing. Down below, in the bronze-lined chamber beneath the ziggurat, Ubartutu took his first step in 12,000 years. It wasn't graceful. Stone that had become bone again protested. Muscles remembered what they were supposed to do, but only slowly. He pulled his hands away from the capstone. Crystal clung to his palms. then cracked and fell in glittering shards. He looked around. The chamber was almost exactly as he'd left it. Same walls, same polished floor, same humming resonance between bronze and basalt. But the song of the flame had changed. The connection that once ran clean and straight to Nibiru now curled inward, closing loops, building a local circuit. The bridge was no longer a road. It was a weapon or a shield, depending on who held it. He closed his eyes. Above ground, a wave of dizziness rippled through the camp. Several people dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as images flashed uninvited across their minds. An old king with stars in his eyes. A flood. A vessel. A judgment. In cities halfway across the world, people who had never heard of Eridu jolted awake from sudden, vivid dreams. A step pyramid on fire. 8 figures in a circle. A voice in their bones saying one thing. We are returning. The governments did what governments do. Some tried to suppress information. Others weaponized it. One bloc formed a task force to assess and neutralize any potential extraterrestrial threat. Another convened theologians to interpret the event through the lens of ancient scripture. Stock markets dipped. Conspiracy channels exploded. Some people went about their day, shrugging it off as just one more impossible thing in a world that had gotten weirder every year. Others sold their possessions and moved inland. In all of this, a handful of people, scientists, historians, translators, restless night dreamers, began to piece together a narrative. The Sumerians had written about kingship descending from heaven. They recorded 8 pre-flood rulers whose reigns lasted SARS, 3,600-year cycles. They'd said the flood came. The kings left. Humanity reset. Now, a wandering planet with a 3,600-year orbit was inbound. An ancient structure, tuned to that orbit, had come alive. Something under was awake. The pattern didn't just rhyme. It was the same song, starting again after a very long pause. U-Bar-Tutu reached the stairs leading out of the chamber. Their angle spoke to memory in his feet. Every step triggered a flash from the past. The night the judges came. The days of frantic building. Zayusider's eyes when he realized he'd have to watch everyone else die. He climbed. When he reached the top of the shaft and stepped into the open air, the world stabbed his senses. The sky was wrong. It had too much metal in it. Trails of objects moving far faster than any bird crisscrossed the blue. Devices hummed and blinked all around the ziggurat. Cameras, drones, scanners, generators. The people wore strange skins, fabrics that gleamed and rustled and glowed with logos. But under all the newness, the same things were there. The sun, the wind, the fear. A shout went up from the excavation team. He didn't look like the statues exactly. Those were stylized, idealized versions of the 8 at the height of their power. U-Bar-Tutu now was thinner, his light subdued, his skin more stone than bronze. His eyes, though, those were the same. Depths that made you feel like your thoughts had just been filed. Security personnel reached for weapons. Some of them froze mid-motion, as their hands simply refused to complete the gesture. We will not start that way again, a voice said. They heard it in their bones, not their ears. Hassan, still pale from the chamber, met the figure's gaze and knew. U-Bar-Tutu, he whispered. The king inclined his head, a small acknowledgement that carried the weight of ages. The cycle resumes, he said. The crossing world approaches. Judgment follows. One of the younger archaeologists, still clinging to the edge of normal, blurted, You mean God? U-Bar-Tutu's eyes softened, almost pitying. Judges, he said, higher than us, not higher than all. He turned slowly, taking the equipment, the cameras, the vehicles, the evidence of a civilization that had climbed far beyond mud brick and bronze. You have come far, he murmured. Farther than they wanted, farther than we dared. Sarah watched him from a live feed thousands of miles away, one hand over her mouth. What happens, she said quietly to no one, when gods come back and find their children aren't children anymore? On the ziggurat, the flame roared, tasting the attention of billions of eyes and lenses. When kingship descended from heaven before, Ubartudu said, his voice carrying across microphones and through camera mics and directly into nervous systems. You knelt. He looked straight into one of the cameras and through it into living rooms, phones, laptops, giant screens, and public squares. The question now, he said, is simple. His gaze sharpened. When kingship descends again, will you kneel? Or will you stand? The world didn't answer right away. How could it? One moment, most people were worried about bills, deadlines, and notifications. The next, there was a column of fire in Iraq, a dark planet on an inbound orbit, and an ancient king on every screen asking the question nobody had language for yet. Will you kneel or will you stand? For a few days, everything fractured. Some people dropped straight into worship. They didn't wait for doctrine or official approval. They saw the flame, saw Ubartutu, heard the word Anunnaki, and their souls snapped to attention like they'd been waiting for this moment since the first story they ever heard as a child. Online, new sects spun up overnight. The Church of the Returning Kings, Children of Nibiru, Flame Keepers of Eridu. Old religions reacted in different ways. Some denounced the whole thing as a deception, a test, a demonic imitation. Others tried to fold it into their frameworks. These are the Watchers. These are the gods mentioned in our scriptures. These are the beings our prophets warned about. Governments did what governments do. They argued about jurisdiction, about weapons, about who got to talk to the being on the ziggurat, and what they were allowed to promise on behalf of 8 billion people. Scientists were split down the middle. Half of them leaned into awe. We are looking at a technological continuity that spans at least one full pre-flood civilization. They said, eyes shining. If we can learn from this, we could leap centuries ahead. The other half leaned into fear. We barely survived giving ourselves nuclear weapons, they pointed out. Now we're about to get a live demonstration of a technology that once almost tore the world in half. Maybe learning is not the priority here. And then there were the people in between. The ones who watched the videos, read the transcripts, stared up at the sky where a dot of darkness was getting mathematically closer every day, and felt something deep and wordless. Anger. Because underneath all the myth and cosmic spectacle, the story was simple. Someone had come, claimed ownership, imposed the system, burned a bridge, flooded the board, reset the game. And now they were coming back to inspect their property. For a species that had spent the last few hundred years clawing its way out from under kings and emperors, the idea of kingship descending from heaven wasn't as comforting as it used to be. On the ziggurat, Ubartutu watched all this unfold through screens, through briefings, through the stunned and defiant eyes of the people who came to stand at the base of his ancient monument. He understood more than they realized. He'd been the one who asked to save a remnant. He'd watched that remnant forget almost everything. Except, apparently, the part of the story that refused to accept being a slave. In a tent filled with monitors, Hassan sat across from him, feeling like a grad student explaining TikTok to a pharaoh. You need to understand, Hassan said, gesturing at the screen that showed protests, celebrations, riots. They're not one thing. There's no humanity you can make a deal with. There are nations, cultures, factions, people who would worship you. People who would dissect you. People who would call you a hoax. Good, Ubartutu said. Hassan blinked. Good. When we first came, Ubartutu replied, you had only one response of power, obedience. Kneel or die. You have added others. He nodded toward the scenes of marches and arguments, dissent, debate, laughter. The corner of his mouth twitched. Memes. He pronounced the last word like it was a dangerous chemical. And when the judges arrive, Sarah's face appeared on a screen. The link from her observatory had become a constant presence. They won't be interested in memes or nuance. They'll see a species that exceeded its blueprint again. Yes, Ubartutu said, they will come with only 2 categories in their minds, acceptable tools or threats to be erased. So, what are you here for? Someone from the World Council delegation demanded, to prepare us to kneel or to stand? For a moment, he didn't answer. He walked to the edge of the ziggurat instead, looking out over a desert that had once been seafloor, then city, then seafloor again. The flame behind him pulsed, more stable now, but still wild around the edges. In the age before the flood, he said, voice amplified by a dozen microphones, but somehow still sounding intimate, we believe there were only two choices: obey or be destroyed. Raise you just enough to serve, never enough to threaten. He looked down at his own hands, flexing fingers that had once turned to stone. We were wrong. He turned back to the cameras. You have built your own bridges, machines in the sky, eyes that see beyond your world. You have touched the code of life, spoken to the tiny fires in your own blood. You have done in a handful of thousands of years what took us hundreds of thousands. He paused, letting that sink in. You're already rivals. The word dropped like a stone into a still lake. So what do we do? Sarah asked. 7 years. What does standing even look like against something that shuts off the stars? You have technologies we never did. Ubar-22 said. Weapons we never imagined. Weaknesses we never had. You are fragile, chaotic, divided. That is your danger. He let the silence stretch. It is also your niche. He stepped closer to the flame. Its light haloed him, making the stone of his skin glow as if lit from within. When Nibiru enters, he said, the judges will do what they always do. Freeze the heavens. Lock the system. Impose stillness. They like order, predictability, linear outcomes. He smiled then, and it was not a comforting expression. You are not orderly. On the screens, news feeds showed protests in one city, spontaneous mass meditations in another, engineers working late in underground labs, teenagers on rooftops filming the strange new star with their phones. When they arrive, Ubar-22 continued, they will expect a world like the one they left, a planet with no flame, no kings, no saplings of their own niche. They will not expect resistance coordinated across oceans in seconds. They will not expect minds that carry myths and mathematics in the same breath. You think we can fight them? The World Council delegate asked. You could hear the hunger and terror braided together in the question. I think you can do what we couldn't, Ubar-22 said. Refuse the frame. The frame? Hassan asked. Kneel or die. Ubar-22 said simply. Tool or threat. They only understand those two categories. You must make a third. Sarah's voice sharpened. What does that look like in practice? His gaze turned distant, as if he were watching a simulation play out on some inner screen. On the last day of the old age, he said slowly, Zayusadra stood alone on a mountain with a single vessel. When the waters came, he had no choice but to ride them. When the judges froze the sky, he had no choice but to avert his eyes. A faint tremor passed through his features. He did not have 8 billion minds. He did not have networks that move thoughts at the speed of light. He did not have satellites watching the crossing world. He did not have weapons that can touch the upper air. He looked directly into the camera again. You do. So we build weapons, the delegate said. Aim everything at the sky and hope. We build everything, Sarah cut in. Defenses, detectors, fail-safes. We share data instead of hoarding it. We stop pretending this is a local problem. If the orbit stays stable, every 3,600-year civilization out there faces the same tests. Ubar-22 nodded. Kneeling is a choice, he said. So is standing. But you must understand, standing does not mean winning easily. It may mean losing loudly. Losing loudly? Hassan echoed. Making it costly, Ubar-22 said, refusing to be erased quietly, forcing them to change their pattern, even slightly. He looked back at the flame. When kingship descended from heaven the first time, he said, we shaped you into what they wanted, servants who could build. This time, perhaps, you will shape them. The thought was insane. The thought was intoxicating. In living rooms and comment sections, in parliaments and prayer circles, the same conversation flared. Not are the Anunnaki gods, but what are we going to do about them? Some humans would kneel. Of course they would. Fear, awe, hope, they'd all pull in that direction. But others felt something old and feral stir in their chests. We survived the flood, their bones whispered. We survived kings and plagues and wars and our own worst impulses. We walked on the moon. We split the atom. We taught machines to talk back. We might not be ready, but we're not children. The Sumerian tablets say, when kingship descended from heaven, it was an Eridu. Maybe this time, kingship doesn't descend. Maybe it arrives expecting subjects and meets something else. A council of nations that don't agree with each other, but agree on this. We are not property. A species that remembers, dimly but stubbornly, that it has drowned before and climbed out of the water anyway. On the ziggurat, under a sky already bending slightly around the dark planet's approach, Tutu stood between ancient flame and a modern world. Behind him, 241,200 years of rule, a drowned age and a broken covenant. In front of him, 7 years. 7 years to decide what kind of story humanity tells about itself when something bigger than God shows up and demands an answer. This time, the tablets are still being written, not in wet clay, but in code and broadcast and memory, in videos and histories, and the choices billions of people make every day as the point of light in the sky grows slowly, inexorably brighter. When kingship descend from heaven again, it won't be onto a silent plain with a few terrified tribes watching. It will be onto a planet full of cameras, missiles, quantum computers, particle accelerators, meditation circles, conspiracy channels, hackers, mystics, skeptics, and children who grew up with the whole world in their pockets. Some will kneel. Some will stand. Some will do something no one, not kings, not Anunnaki, not judges, has planned for. The flame of Eridu burns on, no longer just a beacon of heaven, but a signal to us. The age before the flood is gone. The age of kings is gone. What comes next, the age after gods, is ours to write.